It's 1955. Morning in America. The first sound most mornings began with wasn't a voice. It was a thud on the porch. The newspaper, thrown from a bicycle by a boy who had been awake since before the sun, who knew every driveway on his route by feel more than sight, who would fold and toss 1,000 papers before most of the street had opened its eyes. Inside, someone picks it up, unfolds it on the kitchen table, still creased from the press. The ink smell is sharp, almost metallic. The headlines are large and certain, the way headlines were in 1955. Not shouting, exactly, but never unsure of themselves either. Inside those pages was a whole version of the world. Local news on one page, national news on another, a recipe column, box scores, a weather report that people trusted because there wasn't much else to trust instead. In the kitchen, breakfast is already underway. A pan on the stove. Eggs, maybe bacon if the week has gone well. Toast made under a broiler, watched carefully because a distracted moment meant starting over. Coffee brewing on the stovetop, in a percolator that clicked and gurgled its way through the room, filling it with a smell that meant morning the way nothing else quite did. The refrigerator hums in the corner. It is a newer thing in many homes, still spoken of with a kind of quiet pride. Before it, there was ice delivered by hand, blocks hauled in with tongs, a card in the window telling the driver how many pounds to leave. Now the cold just happens, quietly, on its own, and no one has to think about it anymore. A radio is on somewhere in the house, not loud. A voice reading the morning news, or a song drifting in from a station that plays the same handful of records all week, until everyone in America seems to know the words without ever having tried to learn them. Outside, the neighborhood is beginning to move. A car door closes. An engine turns over, catches, settles into an idle. Somewhere a bus is working its way down a wider street, stopping, opening its doors with a hiss, closing them again. Children appear on porches with book bags and metal lunch pails, walking in 2s and 3s toward a school that is close enough to walk to, because in 1955, most things still were. Men leave for work in hats. Almost all of them, hats. It would have looked strange not to. Women in many of these houses are staying behind. Not idle, never idle, but running a house that in 1955 was itself a kind of full-time occupation, with its own tools, its own schedule, its own quiet expertise that history would later underappreciate. This is the ordinary choreography of an ordinary morning. No one in it feels like they're living inside something that will one day be looked back on. They're just getting through a Tuesday. But we are looking back on it now. And there's something worth noticing in how unremarkable it all felt to the people living it. That's usually how it goes with the past. It rarely feels historic while it's happening. It just feels like breakfast. The American home. Let's stay here a little longer, in the house. Because the house itself has something to tell us, if we're willing to sit with it. The living room in 1955 was arranged around a center of gravity that hadn't quite settled yet. In some homes, that center was still the radio, a large wooden cabinet, more furniture than appliance, that had anchored family evenings for 2 decades already. In others, a newer shape had appeared in the corner. A television set, its screen small and slightly curved, its cabinet built with the same seriousness as a piece of good furniture, because in 1955 no one was quite sure yet whether this was a passing novelty or the center of the American home. It would turn out to be the second one, but nobody in that room could have told you that for certain yet. The furniture had a particular character, solid, built to be used for a very long time and then handed down, because things in 1955 were often made with the assumption that someone else would eventually inherit them. A couch with a slipcover, chosen carefully because slipcovers were serious decisions. A coffee table that held a stack of magazines nobody had quite finished reading. An ashtray, because in 1955, an ashtray was simply part of a living room, unremarkable in a way that would seem strange only decades later. In the kitchen, because kitchens deserve their own attention, new things were arriving quickly. Electric mixers, toasters that popped the bread up on their own, which still felt faintly miraculous to anyone old enough to remember toasting bread over a fire not so many decades earlier. Pressure cookers, a new kind of convenience that promised to give women back some of the hours the house otherwise demanded of them. None of this was luxury, exactly. It was aspiration, made physical. A family's slow, steady climb toward a version of comfortable that their own parents hadn't had access to. What did an ordinary American home actually feel like in 1955? It felt, more than anything, like it was becoming something. Like the country itself had decided all at once, in millions of separate living rooms, that this was the decade to build a life that could last. New houses were going up on the edges of nearly every town, in long rows of nearly identical shapes, and the people moving into them were, for the most part, the first in their families to own anything like it. That mattered more than it might sound like it should. A yard, a driveway, a mortgage that, unbelievably, might actually be paid off one day. If you sat in one of these living rooms in the early evening, with the light going soft outside the window and the radio or the television murmuring low in the corner, you'd feel something specific. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to arrival. The street outside is wide and mostly quiet, lined with cars that all seem to share a kind of confidence in their shape. Long, curved, chrome, catching whatever light is available, as if even a parked car in 1955 wanted to look like it was already moving. Downtown isn't far. It rarely was in 1955. A 10-minute drive, sometimes a walk, into a main street that still meant something specific and singular. Not a shopping center on the edge of town, not yet, but an actual street with actual storefronts, each one known by name to nearly everyone who passed it. The department store anchors one end of the block. Tall windows, carefully arranged, changed by hand every few weeks by someone whose whole job was making a pane of glass tell a small story. Inside, wide aisles, wooden counters, clerks who knew half their customers by name and the other half by face. There's a rhythm to shopping in 1955 that feels almost ceremonial now. You dressed for it. You didn't simply run an errand. You went downtown, and going downtown was, in its own small way, an occasion. Further along, a diner. A long counter, stools bolted to the floor, a row of booths along the window. The smell of coffee that's been on the burner slightly too long, and grease from a griddle that's been going since 6 that morning. A waitress moving between tables with a coffee pot in one hand and an order pad in the other, calling out to the cook in a shorthand only the two of them fully understood. People linger here. Lunch counters in 1955 were as much about conversation as they were about food. News got passed along a counter faster than any newspaper could print it. Across the street, a barber shop, its striped pole turning slowly. A row of men waiting on wooden chairs, reading the same newspaper that had landed on porches that morning, now 3 hands deep into its life. And at the end of the block, the marquee. The movie theater is, in many towns, the single brightest thing on the street once evening comes. Its lights, the only real spectacle for blocks in any direction. During the day, it sits quiet, almost modest, but everyone on the street glances at it anyway, checking without quite meaning to what's showing this week. A drugstore on the corner has a soda fountain built right into the counter, and on a warm afternoon, there is almost always someone perched there, unhurried, in no rush to be anywhere else. A hardware store next door has bins of loose nails and screws out front, sorted by size, weighed out by hand on a small brass scale behind the register. The owner has run the place for as long as anyone on the street can remember, and he can usually tell you not just where something is on the shelf, but what you're probably trying to fix with it. A policeman walks the block at an unhurried pace, nodding to shopkeepers by name, pausing now and then just to watch the street go by. There's little for him to do most days beyond exactly this. This is Main Street in the middle of the decade. Not grand, not cinematic in the way it might later be remembered. Just alive in an unhurried, specific way. A version of American life built entirely at walking pace, where nearly everything you needed was within a few blocks, and nearly everyone you passed, you already knew. But downtown was never where most of the day happened. Most of the day happened in quieter places. Places history doesn't usually think to visit. In a factory on the edge of town, the noise is constant and enormous. The particular roar of machinery that a man could work 8 hours beside and still, somehow, learn to think through. Assembly lines were the backbone of a huge portion of American work in 1955. And they demanded something specific: attention, repetition, endurance. A shift started and a shift ended, and in between, a family's whole week took shape around it. In an office downtown, a different kind of routine. Rows of desks, the clatter of typewriters, dozens of them at once, a sound so constant it eventually became a kind of silence to the people who worked inside it. Men in shirt sleeves and loosened ties by mid-afternoon. Women running the administrative machinery of nearly every business in the country, doing work that was essential and, all too often, invisible. And in a classroom, not far from either, rows of wooden desks bolted to the floor, a chalkboard at the front, a teacher who likely knew every child's family, every child's older siblings, sometimes every child's parents from when they themselves had once sat in that same room. Children in 1955 spent their days in a world with fewer choices than the one that would follow it, but perhaps a clearer one. School in the morning, chores in the afternoon, playing outside until the light started to go, because that was usually the only signal that told you it was time to head home. At recess, a game of stickball takes over a side street. A chalk-drawn hopscotch grid fades a little more with every foot that lands on it, and somewhere a jump rope keeps time to a rhyme that's been passed down, almost unchanged, for longer than anyone playing it could say. What did people actually spend their days doing? Mostly this. Working with their hands or their attention in rooms that asked something specific and repeatable of them, day after day, in exchange for a life that, slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, was getting a little more comfortable than the one their own parents had known. There was no illusion of ease in any of it. The work was real and often hard, and not everyone shared equally in what it built. But there was, running underneath it, a kind of forward motion, a sense that tomorrow was going to look a little more like the life you were hoping for than yesterday had. That's what most of the day was for most people in 1955. Just that. Quiet, accumulating effort. By late afternoon, the town begins to reverse itself. Cars pull out of downtown and head back toward the houses they came from. The office lights go off floor by floor. The factory whistle sounds, and for a moment the machinery goes still, and hundreds of men step out into ordinary daylight, looking faintly surprised by how normal the outside world still is. The bicycles are back on the sidewalks. School has let out hours ago, and the games that filled the afternoon are winding down as the light starts to change color, gold sliding toward orange. Back in the house, the evening has its own rhythm, as fixed and familiar as the mornings had been. Dinner is the center of it. Not fast, not a formality to get through on the way to something else. In most homes in 1955, Dinner was the one guaranteed hour when the whole family sat at the same table, and there was an expectation, rarely spoken aloud, that this hour mattered. The radio is on again, softer now than it was that morning. Or increasingly, in more houses each month, the television is. And here is where something quietly enormous is happening, almost too slowly to notice. 1955 sits right in the middle of a shift that would change the shape of American evenings forever. Only a few years earlier, the television had been a novelty, something a neighbor might have, and everyone else came over to see. Now it's becoming ordinary, a fixture, the new center of gravity in the living room, replacing the radio the way the radio itself had once replaced simply sitting and talking. The room arranged toward it, the lights lowered a little. A variety show, or a comedy, or the news, delivered now with pictures instead of only a voice. There's a particular sound to a house settling into its evening. Water running through pipes upstairs. A dish set down gently in a sink that will be washed properly in the morning. The soft creak of a rocking chair, back and forth, in a rhythm no one has to think about anymore. In the kitchen, the day's last small tasks are being finished. Leftovers wrapped and set into the refrigerator. The stove wiped down. A lunch pail rinsed out and left to dry by the sink, ready to be filled again before sunrise. The evening newspaper, a second edition many towns still had, arriving lighter and later than the morning one, sits half-read on the arm of a chair. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor is out watering a lawn that doesn't really need it, simply because the evening is pleasant enough to be outside in a little longer. Someone else waves from a porch. A few words are exchanged, nothing important, the kind of conversation that exists only to say, "We're still here, still keeping an eye on the same street together." And through it all, the soft blue flicker of television light behind curtains, up and down the street, house after house, all of them tuned, more often than not, to the very same program at the very same hour. The day that began with a newspaper thrown onto a porch is ending with a glow behind a curtain. That, in its way, is the whole shape of 1955 in a single evening.